The BRATVA'S ruin. Part 6. Blood and inheritance. There are men who fight for territory, and men who fight for money, and then there are men who have waited so long for their inheritance that patience itself has become a kind of violence. Chapter 1. The name he gave. Andrei brought the report to the study at 9 in the morning. 3 days after the visit in the Lithuanian prison cell had been recorded by an informant inside the facility's administration. A man Nikolai had cultivated years earlier for reasons that had nothing to do with Sofia and everything to do with the patient, comprehensive way he built redundancy into every relationship that mattered. The visitor identified himself to the prison log as a lawyer, Andrei said, setting the file on the desk. Representing an entity called Severin Consulting, registered in Luxembourg. The registration is 11 days old. A shell, Nikolai said. An extremely well-constructed shell, Andrei said. Built specifically, it appears, for this visit. Whoever is behind it wanted deniability and was willing to spend real money to manufacture it on short notice. Sofia, sitting across the desk with her coffee going cold in front of her, leaned forward. What name did he give Merk? He didn't give a name to the prison administration, but our informant inside the facility recorded part of the conversation through the cell's audio monitoring, which is standard for high-security visits. Andrei pressed a button on the small recorder he placed on the desk. The audio was thin and distant, but the words were clear enough. Merk's voice, flat and wary. "Who are you?" And the visitor's voice, unhurried, almost amused. "Tell him Tarasov sent his regards. He'll know what that means, even if she doesn't." The room went very still. Sofia looked at Nikolai. "Tarasov," she said. "Do you know that name?" Nikolai's expression had gone through its full architecture of containment and arrived somewhere she hadn't seen before. Not fury, not the cold calculation she associated with operational threats, but something that looked, for just a moment, like genuine unease. It was a rare enough sight that it unsettled her more than any threat assessment could have. "Yes," he said slowly. "I know the name. I had hoped never to hear it again." Chapter 2. What an I knew about Tarasov. He told her in the library, with the fire built up against a cold that had nothing to do with the weather, and Alina present this time. Because Sofia had insisted, because whatever this was, it touched her mother's history as much as her own, and the era of managed information, of careful withholding for the sake of protection, was one she had told Nikolai plainly she would not tolerate again. Grigory Tarasov was the original architect of the 1985 structure, Nikolai said. Not Sabal. Sabal was the operational name used in the partnership documents, the name your grandfather's lawyers recorded for the Russian side of the arrangement. But Sabal was never the man who actually controlled the money. He was a lieutenant, a trusted face for a man who never wanted his own name anywhere near the paperwork. "Tarasov," Alina said quietly. Her hands had gone still in her lap, and something in her face suggested this was not, entirely, an unfamiliar name to her either. "You've heard it," Sofia said, watching her mother. "Once," Alina said. "In 1999, when the man came to threaten me about the dissolution letter, he mentioned, almost in passing, that the Sabal interest answered to someone above it. He never gave a name. He said only that there was a man who had been patient for a very long time, and that my father had understood this, and that I would be wise to understand it too." She looked at Nikolai. "Is this the same man?" "If he's still alive," Nikolai said. "He would be in his early 80s now, old enough that I assumed, when I researched the structure originally, that whoever held the founding interest had either died or transferred control decades ago. I found no trace of an active Tarasov in any of the relevant networks." He paused. "Which means either he has been extraordinarily careful for 30 years, or someone is using his name as a weapon precisely, because it carries weight that a living person no longer needs to justify." "Either way," Sofia said, "someone with serious resources just identified themselves to a man in prison, specifically to send a message to us." "Yes. What does he want?" Nikolai was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know yet, but the timing tells us something. He moved the moment Merk's organization collapsed and the Baltic territory became contestable. He moved the moment your mother's existence became public within our circle. He's watching closely enough to know both of those things happened almost simultaneously. He held Sofia's gaze. Whoever this is, they have been waiting for an opening for a very long time, and they have just decided this is it. Chapter 3, The Second Envelope. It came 4 days later, and this time there was no ambiguity about who had sent it. The envelope was identical in weight and quality to the one that had carried Alina's photograph, but the handwriting was different, more formal, almost calligraphic, the hand of someone for whom penmanship had once been a matter of education and class rather than convenience. To Sofia Marchetti Volkova Sokolova, it read, "Heir to interests she does not yet fully understand." Inside, a single sheet of heavy paper and on it a family tree. Sofia spread it across the desk in the study, with Nikolai, Alina, and, at Sofia's insistence, her father all present, because this concerned the entire fractured, reassembling shape of her family, and she would not have anyone in this room hearing a partial truth ever again. The tree began with a name she didn't recognize at its root, Anatoly Tarasov, B. 1944. Beneath him, 2 branches. One led, through several intermediate names, to Giuseppe Marchetti, her grandfather, marked not as an equal partner but disturbingly as nephew. Sofia stared at the page. My grandfather was Tarasov's nephew. If this is accurate, Nikolai said carefully, studying the document, it changes the entire nature of the 1985 partnership. It wasn't 3 independent parties entering an agreement. It was an uncle bringing his nephew into a structure he already controlled, using the nephew's clean Italian identity and legitimate business background as cover for the real architecture beneath it. My grandfather wasn't a partner, Sofia said slowly. He was a front. Possibly, Nikolai said, or possibly something more complicated. The document doesn't tell us his level of awareness or consent. It only tells us the blood relationship existed and was, apparently, deliberately obscured from the partnership's formal records. Alina had gone very pale, looking at the page. My father never told me he had an uncle, she said. Never once. Not in any conversation, any family story, any photograph I ever saw growing up. She looked up. If this is true, he hid it as carefully as I hid my own survival. Piotr, who had been silent through most of this, leaned forward and pointed at the second branch of the tree. The one that did not lead to the Marchetti line at all, but split off in a different direction entirely, toward a cluster of names dated across the following decades. Who are these? He asked. Sofia followed his finger. The second branch led, through 3 generations, to a name at the bottom that had been circled in the same formal hand that had addressed the envelope. Mikhail Tarasov, B. 1981, sole surviving heir. He has a living grandson, Sofia said, or great-nephew by the actual blood relationship, which means there are 2 surviving branches of the original founding interest, Nikolai said. Yours, through the Marchetti line, and his, through direct descent. He looked at the document for a long moment. And whoever sent this wants you to understand, very specifically, that you are not the only heir in this story, that there is another claimant, with a stronger and more direct bloodline claim than the one your grandfather was given as a front. He's not just informing us, Sofia said slowly, the legal architecture of the situation assembling itself in her mind with the same cold clarity she'd brought to the Zurich dissolution. He's establishing a competing claim. To whatever remains of the original structure, the Baltic territory now that Merck's gone, any residual assets, any operational value left in what's collapsing. Yes, Nikolai said. And he's doing it by introducing himself as family, Sofia said, specifically so that whatever conflict follows feels less like a war and more like an inheritance dispute, which is so much harder to fight cleanly. Chapter 4, The Meeting Request. The third communication arrived within the week. And this one was not ambiguous about its intentions at all. A formal letter, delivered through an actual law firm in Vienna, legitimate, verifiable, with a 100-year history, and a reputation, Dr. Kellen, when consulted, confirmed was impeccable. The letter requested on behalf of a client identified only as the Tarasov estate. A meeting with Sofia Sokolova to discuss matters of shared family inheritance requiring resolution. "It's formal," Sofia said, reading it for the third time at the kitchen table, with her mother across from her and Nikolai beside her. "Deliberately formal. He's not threatening me. He's inviting me to a negotiation through channels designed to make refusal look unreasonable." "You don't have to go," Elena said. Her voice carried the specific tightness of a mother who had spent 23 years unable to protect her daughter from anything and was finding the impulse to do so now almost unbearable. "Whatever this is, whatever he wants, you don't owe him a meeting." "I know I don't owe him anything," Sofia said gently. "But I think refusing would tell him something about us that I don't want him to know, that we're afraid of what he might reveal. And I would rather control the room than let him control the narrative from outside it." Nikolai had been quiet through this exchange, reading the letter again. His expression carrying the particular stillness she had learned meant he was running through every possible configuration of risk. "If we go," he said finally, "we go on our terms, a location of our choosing, full security, and we go with everything Dr. Kellen and Andrei can assemble about Anatoly Tarasov and his grandson before we sit at any table." He looked at Sofia. "I will not let you walk into a room with this man undefended, legally or otherwise." "I wasn't planning to," Sofia said. "I want the full file on Mikhail Tarasov before I agree to anything. If he's the one actually representing the estate now, if his grandfather is dead or incapacitated, and this is really about him, I want to know exactly who I'm dealing with." Chapter 5. Mikhail Tarasov. What Andrei assembled over the following 4 days painted the picture of a man considerably more complicated than a simple inheritor of criminal ambition. Mikhail Tarasov was 43 years old, educated at the London School of Economics, and had spent the first 15 years of his adult life building a legitimate private equity fund based in Vienna with a specialty in distressed Eastern European real estate. He had no criminal record in any jurisdiction. He had never, as far as Andrei's people could determine, been directly involved in any of the operational structures his grandfather had once controlled. He had built, by every visible measure, a life entirely separate from the world Nikolai inhabited. "This doesn't match the profile of a man suddenly asserting a criminal inheritance claim," Sofia said, reading through the file in the study. "This is someone who spent 2 decades deliberately distancing himself from exactly what we're now assuming he wants." "Unless something changed," Nikolai said. "People who have spent careers building legitimate fortunes sometimes discover, late in life, that legitimate fortunes have limits a criminal inheritance doesn't." He paused. "Or his grandfather is dying, and dying men sometimes develop very specific, very urgent feelings about what they leave behind and to whom." Dr. Kellen, consulted by secure call from Zurich, offered a piece of information that reframed the entire situation. "Anatoly Tarasov," she said, "died 11 days ago, in a private clinic outside Vienna. The death was not publicly reported, which is consistent with a family that has spent decades cultivating invisibility." A pause. "His will was filed for probate 3 days ago. I was able to access certain public elements of the filing through a contact." Another pause, longer this time, the specific weight of a woman delivering information she suspected would matter enormously. "The will references a structure described only by a code name, the 1985 instrument, and it leaves the entirety of Mikhail Tarasov's inheritance from that instrument contingent on a single condition." "What condition?" Sofia asked. "That he establish, formally and through legal process, his claim to the full structure," Dr. Kellen said, "including any interest currently held by remaining Marchetti heirs." The room went quiet. "His grandfather died 11 days ago," Sofia said slowly, "and left him an inheritance that requires him to come after my claim. Not because he wants to, because he has to receive what's left to him." "It would explain the timing," Nikolai said, "and it would explain why the approach has been formal rather than hostile. He may not want this conflict at all. He may simply have no other path to what his grandfather has bound him to inherit." Sofia looked at the file again, at the photograph of Mikhail Tarasov from a Vienna business publication. A composed, unremarkable man in an expensive but understated suit. Nothing in his face suggesting the predatory quality she'd expected from an adversary in this world. "I think," she said slowly, "that this might not be a war at all. I think it might be two people who never asked for any of this, both trying to honor or escape what was forced on them by men who died decades or days ago." She looked at Nikolai. "I want to meet him, not to negotiate from strength, to understand what he actually needs." Chapter 6. The Meeting in Vienna. They chose Vienna, Mikhail's city, a gesture of trust Nikolai had argued against, and Sofia had insisted on, because she believed, with the same instinct that had made her tell Petrov the truth at that first terrible dinner, that meeting a man on his own ground when you have nothing to hide says something important about your intentions. The meeting took place not in a boardroom, but in a quiet cafe near the Stadtpark, at Sofia's specific request, because she had learned in St. Petersburg and Riga, and a dozen smaller moments, since that the truth came easier in rooms that didn't feel like battlefields. Mikhail Tarasov arrived alone, which surprised her, and sat down across the small table with the specific exhausted carefulness of a man who has recently buried someone and has not yet finished grieving them, regardless of how complicated that grief might be. "Ms. Sokolova," he said, "thank you for coming." "Sofia," she said, "if we're discussing family, I'd rather not pretend we're strangers conducting business." Something in his face eased fractionally. "Mikhail, then." Nikolai sat beside her, silent, present, watching. The specific quality of attention she had come to recognize as his way of holding space for her to lead, while remaining entirely ready to act if the situation required it. "I read your grandfather's obituary file," Sofia said. "What there was of it. I'm sorry for your loss, regardless of everything else that complicates it." Mikhail looked at her for a long moment. "You're the first person in this entire situation who has said that to me and seemed to mean it," he said. "Everyone else, my own family's lawyers, the people my grandfather surrounded himself with at the end, they've all treated his death as a transaction, an event that triggers obligations." He looked down at his coffee. "I loved my grandfather, Sofia, despite everything he was. Despite what I came to understand, as I got older, about what he'd actually built and protected and used people to maintain. He raised me after my parents died when I was 9. He paid for my education. He never once, in my entire life, asked me to participate in any part of what he controlled, until the very end." "The will," Sofia said. "The will," he agreed. "I didn't know about the condition until after he died. I didn't know about any of it, the 1985 structure, the Marchetti connection, any of it, until 3 weeks ago, when his lawyers explained what I would need to do to receive what he'd left me." He looked up. "I built my entire life specifically to avoid this world, Sofia. I have spent 20 years making sure no one could ever say I benefited from what my grandfather actually was. And now, the final thing he's done from beyond his own death is force me to either walk into exactly the world I escaped, or walk away from an inheritance that would otherwise be mine." "What's the inheritance specifically?" Sofia asked. "Approximately 60 million euros, Mikhail said. "Held in structures I have no familiarity with, in jurisdictions I have no experience operating in, accessible only if I formally establish my claim against any remaining interest, which his lawyers identified as you." He held her gaze. "I don't want to fight you, Sofia. I don't want your money or your husband's territory or any piece of whatever you and your family have already suffered to arrive where you are. I came here today because I wanted to look at the person I was apparently obligated to fight and decide, for myself, whether there was another way." Sofia studied him for a long moment. She thought about her mother, 23 years stolen by men who treated family as leverage. She thought about her grandfather, used as a front by an uncle who never told him, or perhaps did tell him, and he'd simply never told his own daughter. She thought about the specific, generational cruelty of men who built fortunes out of relationships they never intended to honor. "I don't want to fight you either," she said, "and I don't think we have to." Chapter 7. The Offer. "Tell me what your grandfather's structure actually holds," Sofia said. "Not the legend of it, the actual remaining assets." Mikhail produced a folder. He had clearly anticipated this question, had come prepared for exactly this kind of direct engagement, which told her something reassuring about the kind of negotiator he was. 60 million euros, primarily in Austrian and Liechtenstein holding structures. No operational criminal interests. My grandfather divested from anything actively illegal nearly 15 years ago, as far as I can determine. What remains is essentially passive capital, real estate. Some equity positions in legitimate companies. He paused. It is, strangely, almost entirely clean money at this point. Money that started dirty in 1985 and has spent nearly 40 years laundering itself through legitimate use, the way old fortunes do. And your claim to it depends on establishing precedence over mine. According to the will's condition, yes. Though I confess I don't fully understand the legal mechanism. My own lawyers have struggled to interpret exactly what establishing the claim would require in practice. Sofia looked at Nikolai, who gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod, an invitation to proceed however she judged best. I think, Sofia said slowly, that your grandfather in his final act made the same mistake every man in this story has made. He assumed that family connection meant competition, that blood was a battlefield rather than something that could simply be shared. She leaned forward. I have no interest in your 60 million euros, Mikhail. I have already closed the Marchetti share of the 1985 structure and given it to a children's hospital in Genoa, because that's what my mother wanted before she was nearly killed for trying. I am not in the business of inheriting old criminal money. I'm in the business, now, of closing doors that men like our grandfathers left open for decades. Mikhail's expression shifted, something like disbelief, carefully restrained. You're saying you'd simply not contest it. I'm saying I'll sign whatever document your lawyers need, waiving any claim, clean and complete, so that you can receive what your grandfather left you without ever having to become anything more than what you already are. She held his gaze. On one condition. Tell me. You use some part of it the way my mother wanted hers used, Sofia said. Not all of it. I'm not asking you to give away your inheritance, only to honor what it cost to create it. A foundation. Something that repairs in some small way the kind of damage these structures did to people who never asked to be involved. She paused. Call it whatever you want. Structure it however your lawyers think is wise. But make some piece of 60 million euros mean something other than what it meant when your grandfather built it. Mikhail looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face, the specific exhausted carefulness from the beginning of their conversation, eased into something that looked almost like relief. My grandfather, he said quietly, spent his entire life making sure that money like this never had to answer to anyone's conscience. I think he would be furious at what you're proposing. A pause. I think I would like to do exactly what you're proposing anyway. Chapter 8. What an Nikolai said on the way home. They flew back to Moscow that evening. The negotiation concluded in under 3 hours. The formal documents already moving through Dr. Kellen's office for drafting. And Sofia sat in the window seat watching Vienna disappear beneath the clouds with the particular lightness of a woman who has just dismantled a war before it could properly begin. You did that, Nikolai said, in under 3 hours. A conflict that could have taken years and cost considerably more than money. I didn't do anything especially clever, Sofia said. I just looked at a man who clearly didn't want to fight and asked myself, what kind of person built a war out of 2 people who agreed, fundamentally, on what mattered? That is, Nikolai said, considerably more clever than you're giving yourself credit for. He paused. Most people in this world assume conflict is the default. You keep finding the cases where it isn't, and you keep being right. Most conflicts in this world are built by men who died decades ago and left their grandchildren holding the obligations, Sofia said. I'm getting very good at recognizing the pattern. Old men make terrible choices, and the people who survive them spend their lives untangling the consequences. She looked at him. Your uncle, Mikhail Tarasov, all the same shape over and over. And you, Nikolai said quietly, keep being the one who breaks the pattern instead of repeating it. She looked at him for a long moment, the cabin lights low, the engines a steady hum beneath them, The entire impossible architecture of the last 4 months. The debt, the marriage, Zurich, St. Petersburg, Riga, Vienna, her mother's return. A war averted in a quiet cafe, settling into something that felt, for the first time in a long while, like it might actually be approaching a kind of peace. "I'd like to stop having wars to avert eventually," she said. "I know," he said. "I'd like that too." He took her hand. "But for whatever it's worth, I have never in my entire life watched anyone do what you just did in that cafe. Disarm an inheritance dispute with kindness and a children's hospital." He brought her hand to his lips. "I married considerably better than I deserved." "You married exactly who you spent 4 years deciding you wanted," she said. "Don't undersell your own judgment." He almost smiled, the small, complete, specifically her smile. "No," he agreed. "I won't." Chapter 9. The Documents. The waiver was finalized within 2 weeks, drafted by Dr. Kellen with the same exacting precision she'd brought to the Marchetti dissolution, and signed in a second meeting. This one in Moscow, at Sofia's request, because she wanted Mikhail to see, however briefly, the life she'd built out of the wreckage their families had left behind. He came for one evening, met Alina over dinner, listened to her describe 23 years in Riga with the specific careful attention of a man who recognized, in her story, an echo of his own family's capacity for using people and discarding their humanity in the process. "My grandfather did this," he said quietly, to Sofia, near the end of the evening, looking at Alina across the room as she laughed at something Pyotr had said, a sound that was becoming, slowly, less rare. "Whatever specific hand he had in it, this is what his structure cost. A woman lost her life in every way that mattered for over 2 decades. He didn't act alone," Sofia said. "Merk inherited and continued it. Sabal enforced it originally. Your grandfather built the foundation, but plenty of other men kept it standing." She looked at him. "I'm not interested in assigning you guilt for what he did before you were born, Mikhail. I'm interested in what you do with what's left." He nodded slowly. "The foundation," he said. "I've started the paperwork. I'm calling it the Marchetti Tarasov Initiative, Family Reconciliation Projects, support for people separated from family by exactly this kind of structure. Disappearances, forced exile, the kind of thing that happened to your mother." He paused. It felt right to put both names on it, to make the families that built the damage the ones repairing it. Sofia felt something move in her chest, not quite tears, but close to it. "My mother would like that," she said. "I think she'd like that very much." Chapter 10. The question Elena asked. That night, after Mikhail had left and the house had settled into its late evening quiet, Alina found Sofia in the library, alone, looking at the fire with the particular stillness of a woman processing the accumulated weight of an extraordinary season. "Can I ask you something?" Alina said, sitting in the chair across from her daughter, the chair that had become, in the weeks since her return, unmistakably hers. "Anything." "Are you happy?" Alina asked. "Not safe, not accomplished. Not surrounded by people who love you, though you are all of those things, and I am grateful beyond words for it. I mean specifically. Are you happy in the way a person is happy when they've chosen their own life rather than survived someone else's plan for it?" Sofia thought about the question with the full seriousness it deserved. She thought about the snow-covered Moscow night 4 months ago, watching a black SUV idle at her father's gates. She thought about the library and the fire and Nikolai's voice in the dark admitting 4 years. She thought about Zurich and St. Petersburg and the kitchen and the 2 Yessis. She thought about her mother, returned, sitting across from her now in firelight that had become, against every possible expectation, simply part of an ordinary evening. "Yes," she said, "I am happy, Mama." The word still felt strange and miraculous in her mouth, the address she'd been denied for 22 years, now simply, quietly true again. "Not despite everything that happened, because of how I chose to meet it." She looked at her mother. "I didn't survive this life, I built it. Every difficult piece of it I chose with full information, the way I told Nikolai I needed to from the very beginning." Elena reached across the space between their chairs and took her daughter's hand. "Then your father and I did one thing right, at least," she said. Whatever else we got wrong, however much time we lost, we raised a daughter who refused to be anything less than the architect of her own life. Sofia held her mother's hand and looked at the fire and let herself, fully and without reservation, feel the peace of an evening that asked nothing more of her than to simply be present in it. 3 weeks later, in a quiet office in Liechtenstein, a junior associate at a private banking concern flagged an unusual transaction for senior review. A €60 million estate, recently settled, had directed an immediate transfer of €12 million to a newly registered charitable foundation. The transaction itself was unremarkable. What caught the associate's attention was a secondary, smaller transfer buried in the same filing, €800,000, moved quietly to an account that internal records flagged, almost as an afterthought, as belonging to a woman named Dasha Kovale in Riga. The associate did not think much of it. It was, after all, simply a generous gesture from a settled estate to a woman who had once worked, briefly and unremarkably, for the deceased's organization. She had no way of knowing that the gesture had not come from Mikhail Tarasov's foundation at all. It had come from an account Sofia Sokolova had quietly established herself, under a name that traced back to nothing recognizable, funded from her own legal fees, and the small, careful accumulation of a life she had built entirely on her own terms. A debt repaid, finally, to the woman who had given her back her mother. And 400 kilometers away, in a different city entirely, a different envelope was being prepared. This one addressed not to Sofia, but to Nikolai Sokolov directly, by a sender whose name would mean nothing to either of them until it was far too late to prevent what it set in motion. End of Part 6. Blood and Inheritance, concluded. Cliffhanger: the Tarasov conflict resolves not in war but in reconciliation, proof that Sofia's particular gift, the thing that makes her unlike anyone else in this world, is her refusal to accept inherited conflict as inevitable. But peace, in this story, has never lasted longer than the time it takes for the next shadow to identify itself. An envelope is already moving toward Nikolai, not toward Sofia this time, but toward the man who has spent 2 months learning, painfully and completely, what it costs to truly let someone matter. And the sender knows something about Nikolai Sokolov's own past, something buried as deep and as carefully as the Marchetti secret ever was, that even Sofia, who has learned to read every layer of his controlled architecture, has never been allowed to see. Part 7. The ghost in Nikolai. For the first time, the surveillance turns inward. Sofia must confront the possibility that the man who knows everything about her has secrets of his own, and that the foundation of trust they built across 6 parts of impossible crisis may be tested by a truth Nikolai himself has spent 20 years trying to outrun.